mythical creatures that turned out to be real.
There's an old saying that goes, truth is stranger than fiction. And I would argue in the case of mythical creatures, this rule definitely applies. The concept of mythology and mythical creatures.
An octopus is definitely pretty much a real-life mythical creature.
Has existed for thousands upon.
That's what first comes to mind when I think of, like, a real-life creature that's closest to fiction. Like the squids, the octopus, like things from the sea. Because, like, the deeper you go, it's like the stranger the animals look.
Thousands of years. And with such a long and rich history, it was only a matter of time until some of these mythical creatures turned out to not be myths at all. Which is why in today's double feature, I'm going to start the video by discussing mythical creatures that turned out to just be creatures, and then I'm going to discuss creatures that still remain mythical, but are heavily believed to be real. Let's begin. Mountain spirits. Deep within the Indonesian jungle lives a group of people known as the Moni people. The Moni are an indigenous tribe of people from the Central Papua and Western New Guinea regions of Indonesia. They primarily speak their own Moni language, and in total there is roughly 28,000 Moni people. Not much is publicly known or understood about the Moni people or their traditions. However, one piece of their culture that has now become sort of mainstream is the not-so-mythical creature known as the mountain spirits. For countless generations, the Moni people have passed down stories of a mysterious black and white creature that lived in the forest. And this creature was believed to be a spirit, a positive spirit that should be protected. The Moni people themselves even said that this mythical creature walked upright like a small man. And while that may seem interesting, for the longest time there was no evidence to back up the claim of this black and white small man spirit that inhabited
Yeah, dude, that actually
this remote part of Indonesia.
That actually does sound like fiction, bro. If I was living in that area and someone told me about that, I would definitely think it's a story.
Which is why, for the longest time, the mountain spirit was considered to be something of myth to foreigners. That was until 1994, when the story of the
It got debunked all the way in 94?
Spiritual mythical creature living deep within the Indonesian jungle came across the desk of a man named
That is so recent.
Tim Flannery. Tim Flannery was a highly decorated researcher from Australia. And when he heard the stories of the mythical creature, he knew there had to be something more to it than just fairy tales. Which is why he booked a flight and was determined to separate fact from fiction himself. After landing in Indonesia and traveling deep into the jungle to meet the Moni people, he was briefed on their customs and culture, and then was briefed on the mountain spirit. The Moni people informed Tim that the mountain spirit was elusive, being seen only rarely by the locals, and that if it was seen, it was to be respected, as it was believed that this mythical creature was a spiritual entity. Timothy could tell that the Moni people took this seriously because when he asked them if they'd ever try to hunt this creature, they instantly denied ever trying to hunt, attack, or approach the spirit, as it was something they almost instantly knew they were to protect. However, even with that interesting story and vague description of white and black creature that sometimes walks on two legs, Tim really didn't know what he was getting himself into. That was until he spent multiple days in the Indonesian jungle and didn't come face to face with any sort of mythical creature or spirit, but actually came in direct contact with a creature known as the dingoso. That's right, the mountain spirit is not a spirit at all. It's actually a rather endangered and extremely rare animal that, in my opinion, is actually more interesting than the mountain spirit.
That does not look like a goddamn mountain spirit. It doesn't look like any kind of that looks like a fucking animal.
Ever could be. Let me explain. The Dizingo is a long-tailed marsupial that can only be found in mountain forests on the west side of New Guinea in Indonesia, which means that for the longest time, the Moni people were the only people in the entire world to even be aware of this animal, even if they did consider it to be a spirit, which honestly isn't unfair, because while they considered it spirit, the rest of the world considered it to be folktale and not even real at all. However, the Moni people knew what they saw, and in my opinion, you should always trust the locals. Back to the dingoso though. The dingoso is also a mammal that is roughly shaped like a bear. It lives in trees. It's the size of a Labrador dog, and believe it or not, it is technically...
It looks smaller than what it really is.
A breed of kangaroo, which, if you ask me, is the most interesting and random combination of attributes you could probably imagine. Regardless, after Tim Flannery was able to confirm the existence of this mysterious creature in 1994, The entire suspicion of the mountain spirits just being fairy tale was broken and actually proven to be fact. And while this discovery was shocking news to the rest of the world, to the Moni people, this was simply affirming something they already knew. And fortunately, it didn't break their belief whatsoever. Even after Tim was able to confirm the existence of the Dinguiso and then later name it and categorize it, they still treated it as a sacred symbol and believed that the Dinguiso was the physical embodiment of the spirits of their ancestors. Which, in my opinion, is pretty wholesome. Interestingly, at least in my opinion, if the Moni people didn't consider the Dinguiso to be so sacred, it would have likely been hunted, probably into extinction because of how rare and endangered this animal already is. And if that were to have happened, then realistically, the Dinguiso would have likely never been discovered by the scientific community and therefore remaining a mythical creature forever. Although we know that wasn't the case, and in 1994, the Dinguiso was proven to be a real animal and not just a mythical creature. Although it wasn't until
Y'all know that skunk ape picture that was really popular? That skunk ape picture, that one is probably pretty like has the most evidence towards it being real. That picture looks pretty real.
2009 when it was actually filmed for the first time ever after a BBC documentary crew and a local Moni tribesman spent 11 days in the jungle searching just to find one Dinguiso or mountain spirit, the devil bird. In rural Sri Lanka, there has been a long-told legend of a mythical creature
That is pretty creepy.
known as the ulama or the devil bird. The lore behind the devil bird was simple yet terrifying, and it was for those reasons that it quickly became legend. It is said that if you are in a rural part of Sri Lanka at night, potentially near a jungle or forest, then you could be at risk of hearing the blood-curdling, human-like shriek of the devil bird. Now, while you never saw the devil bird, the shriek alone was enough to turn your blood cold and terrify you, leaving most frozen in fear. However, this shriek wasn't only something that would temporarily scare you, as it
When I get scared, I don't freeze. I fucking dart.
had a deeper meaning. According to Sri Lankan folklore, the shriek of the devil bird wasn't only terrifying, it was an omen of imminent death. And it was believed that if you were outside at night and had been exposed to or have heard the shriek of the devil bird, you or someone you knew or loved was soon going to die. Just the lore alone around this mythical creature is enough to have you invested, even without any description of what it may or may not look like. And it's for this reason that this story was told and believed so heavily within Sri Lanka for generations and generations. Although, for people that were not local to Sri Lanka, when they were told about the devil bird custom, many people disregarded it as something of just that, legend, something of myth, something that was, well, downright not real or non-existent. That was until non-locals started to hear the shriek for themselves. And because the shriek was so terrifying and so human-like and so unlike anything that they've heard elsewhere before, biologists knew they had to take a closer look at what could possibly be causing this myth. Because it was too long-running to simply be one hoaxer, and it was too unique and terrifying to be something that was already currently known. And it was with that in 2001, after some time searching, experts were able to confirm with a high likelihood that the devil bird or ulama was maybe not as mythical as people once thought, and that it was more likely the spot-bellied eagle owl, a bird that in its own right is definitely terrifying. The spot-bellied eagle owl is a huge bird of prey.
That does look really terrifying. That looks pretty terrifying right there.
That literally just looks terrifying. Like it looks like a mythical creature. These
Yeah, it
birds
does.
live primarily in the forest and live mainly in India and Southeast Asia. They reportedly weigh around 3 pounds, and most notably, this owl is now famous after its semi-recently discovered human-sounding call. The call that essentially made this eagle owl a mythical creature in the first place. Now, with that being said, I know I can't keep talking about this legendary sound without showing it to you.
Yeah,
so I'm
show
going to
me
play a
the
bit of audio
sound.
of a recording somebody took of an actual spot-bellied eagle owl. But I did want to give fair warning in case you were superstitious yourself and did believe that this call may actually bring death to you or a loved one. Which, I wouldn't blame you if that were the case, but with that, here's the sound. Sea serpents. I see serpents. Do you see serpents? I'll tell you who saw serpents. Sailors. Sailors saw serpents so often that they became legendary mythical creatures.
Sea serpents are definitely one of my favorite.
Sea serpents were first reported as massive snake-like creatures that were found in deep, dangerous waters. And in folklore stories of these mythological creatures, they were described as dangerous, ship-attacking monsters. Stories of sea serpents exist in many different cultures and mythologies. For example, Norse mythology, Babylonian mythology, and even Greek mythology. But what if I told you that, once again, this mythical creature
I thought Jormungandr was friendly, or is that only in God of War?
was perhaps not so mythical? For thousands of years, different cultures and civilizations described seeing a nearly impossibly long, snake-like creature approaching their boats and even attacking them. It was actually the persistence of these extremely similar stories being told across numerous cultures that actually inspired scientists in the 1700s to try to finally put this myth to bed once and for all. However, in their studies, they didn't find a nothing burger. What they actually found was fish tacos. That was corny, but we're keeping it in. No, but in reality, in 1772, scientists found what they believed to be what everybody was considering sea serpents to be in all of these different mythological accounts. This fish...
I just realized in the middle of editing, what if sea serpents, like, originally attacked boats because they didn't know what they were? And now that they evolved, they actually know what boats are because they realized what it was, but they were attacking it at first because they thought it was like a large animal or something.
was identified as the oarfish. And the oarfish, similar to some of the other entries on this list, once again just goes to show that fact
Whoa.
is sometimes stranger than fiction. The oarfish is an extremely
That's pretty
long,
cool
ribbon-like fish that is typically only found deep in tropical oceans and is
I've
usually
definitely heard this name before, though.
rarely ever seen by humans. One subsect of the oarfish, known as the giant oarfish, is the longest
That looks like a creature out of, like, Subnautica or something.
bony fish alive and can grow up to 36 feet long. Besides just being rare and massive, oarfish are also extremely unique because they have been sighted swimming vertically, meaning they're not, doing normal fish stuff. They're literally swimming as if they were walking to work. Besides their weird methods of transportation, they also have a rather unique look to them. They have a silvery, scaly body, but they also have a bright red dorsal fin along its back, which definitely makes it stand out against blue water and also gives it a rather mythical appearance to some individuals, further bolstering the theory that this never-before-seen fish was a mythical creature and not your average fish. Which, if you think about it, isn't unreasonable for somebody in the 15 or 1600s or even, earlier than that to see a crazy never-before-seen fish and to assume it's, well, something of myth rather than a never-before-seen fish because of how different it was from most fish we know today, or were even known at the time for that matter. Regardless, even though today it is commonly believed that most sea serpent accounts are simply encounters with oarfish, in the modern day, now that this mythical creature has been more or less...
Leviathan and Jormungandr. Just mistaken by an oarfish.
demystified, it doesn't mean that there isn't any superstition still surrounding this fish. And what I mean by that is that even today, in 2026, the oarfish is still considered not a sea serpent, but a sign of a doomsday event coming. And I'm not joking. It is commonly believed by some that if you find an oarfish washed up on the beach somewhere, there is a very high chance that there will be a devastating earthquake or tsunami to happen shortly after the discovery of this fish.
Do people just be thinking this shit and just like make it up just for the fun of it?
While calling the oarfish a doomsday fish may seem like just another legendary attribute being associated with an animal that is real and not mythical, that superstition
I don't get it.
has unfortunately been bolstered in recent years. From 2009 to 2010 in Japan, there was over 20 oarfish sightings that were washed up on the beaches. And in 2011 in Japan, there was a tragic earthquake that ended up killing over 20,000 people, which has led some people to believe that potentially the sightings of the oarfish had something to do with it, or at least predicted the tragedy. Now, regardless of what you believe personally, I think these...
Just because a fish washes up on land and a tsunami comes afterwards doesn't mean that caused that was like a warning for the doomsday
story
event,
of the
or like it caused the doom. Did I just say doomsday? The natural disaster.
oarfish is just so interesting. Because it started as a fish that was thought to be a sea serpent of legendary proportions, and then it was found out to just be an extremely odd and rare fish. But even then, within its scientific discovery, it took on a whole new meaning as a doomsday fish, which later went on to kind of prove that it
This dude got me mixed up because he's saying doomsday, but doomsday literally means like end of everything, right?
may or may not have some mythical properties after all.
The black swan.
It is reported that in the 1400s, 1500s, and even 1600s in Europe, there was a saying that if you called something a black swan, you were essentially saying that something did not exist. Consider it a post-medieval way of saying when pigs fly. The analogy of a black swan was reportedly rather common, and it, for a long time, was rooted in fact. Across all of Europe, every swan that had ever been seen ever was white, and it was believed for that reason that swans across the globe were only white, because only white swans existed in Europe, hence the existence and popularity of the black swan analogy. Regardless, up until 1697, according to Europe, swans were white and only white, and a swan of any other color was simply not possible. That was until 1697, when Dutch explorer William de Vlaming arrived in Western Australia on an expedition and just so happened to almost instantly be met with a creature that he and everybody he had ever known considered to be something that truly did not exist. He came face to face with a group of black swans. Obviously shocked, William knew that he had to take
That is
some examples
insane.
home with him to prove he was not crazy. Because if he did go home and claim to have seen black swans, he would not only be ridiculed, but potentially even be exiled for suggesting such a crazy thing. And it was with him showing the rest of Europe the existence of the black swan that the entire European mindset was essentially shifted. Initially only about the existence of other types of swans, but the lesson that was taught from this experience was pretty significant. The moral of the story that was kind of taken away from this entire experience down the line was that just because you haven't seen something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And it's actually for that reason exactly that I wanted to add it in this video, because as almost every creature I've discussed has proven, just because you haven't seen it yet doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And the story of the black swan is almost a perfect example, because it wasn't even thought to have existed by anybody. It was literally thought to have never existed, and its mythology was actually in the fact that it could not exist simply because it had never been seen, and it was the opposite of what was seen. To Europe at the time, a black swan was the least likely thing possible, and I'm sure you see the irony.
That was a literal accidental myth that they made up.
The revelation of the existence of the black swan was so significant, in fact, that it actually coined a new term. Before this event, black swans were an analogy of something that simply could not happen, would not happen, does not exist. But after the discovery of black swans in Europe, the term black swan or black swan event was used to describe an event that was rare, unexpected, and challenged beliefs, or has or had outsized effects on society, which is pretty interesting to think about.
The duck-billed bozo.
Okay, I'm gonna keep this section short because it's technically not a mythical creature,
Platypus.
but I
What, you're done already? You've only been here for like 15 seconds, and I was talking for like half of that. What kind of a plumber are you? A platypus plumber? Perry the platypus plumber? Perry the platypus!
really wanted to talk about it because this story is so funny. As most people probably know by now, platypuses are real, but also insane. And likely the best example of fact is stranger than fiction. And that's because platypuses literally have
Looks
mythical
so weird. They look so weird.
creature level lore while being an extremely real creature. And platypuses have such mythical creature level lore that when the first platypus bodies were discovered by European naturalists, the Europeans actually believed that these bodies had to be mutilated bodies of an assortment of different animals because of how strange the platypus appeared. Let me set the scene. The year is 1799. A British explorer is in Australia, once again, and finds this weird creature. They don't know what it's called, they don't know what it's all about, but he sends it back to Britain. The naturalists in Britain examine this creature.
See, this is why Australia is so weird. You got animals over here that can like defy physics, and then you got these insects so gigantic and large, and then you have the goddamn like people deal with like fucking gators and shit and crocodiles like it's nothing over there. Like everything is like an alien down there. Every animal that you see.
that was sent from Australia, and the conclusion they come to was not that this was some unseen animal, but they actually came to the conclusion that somebody must have tampered with this specimen simply because of how outrageous it was. At the time, the platypus was officially considered a hoax by the scientific community simply because of how weird it was. In case you're unfamiliar with exactly how
I
strange
don't fucking blame them, not the tiniest bit. Platypus looks so fucking weird.
platypuses are, let me fill you in. For starters, platypuses are essentially beavers with duck bills and otter feet. And it was actually that exact combination of animals that these British naturalists thought were put together by somebody on the ship who tampered with the specimen. On top of that, platypuses are mammals, but mammals that lay eggs, which is essentially a contradiction, but we're only getting started. On top of laying eggs,
Platypus lay eggs?
platypuses are also venomous. That's right, they basically have little
Wait, what? Venomous?
toenail or little horn on their fins.
Little
that they would
toenail on their fin?
use to stab their prey with and inject them with venom. And if
What?
that wasn't crazy enough, while
This
platypuses
really is some mythical creature shit.
are amphibious, when they go underwater, they close their eyes and ears, making them deaf and blind, and it's because of this in water they rely
It makes their senses better.
on electromagnetic pulses to hunt, which they do rather effectively. And on top of that, they also outsource teeth. That's right, platypuses don't have teeth, but if they need to chew, they'll put rocks in their mouth so that they can use something to crush their food. Now, you might be asking, if they lay eggs, do they feed
That's a weird strap, but smart. Okay, I get it.
their young like birds? And the answer is, of course not. Since platypuses are mammals, they have milk, but they don't have nipples. They feed their young through their armpit milk. That's right, their milk comes out of their armpits.
Oh, what the fuck? How? Is it like sweat? Do they sweat milk?
Go on a lot longer about platypus facts, but I think you guys get the idea. Platypuses are so strange that when they were first discovered, they were considered to be a hoax or something of mythology. And even after describing this very real creature to you now, I'm still not convinced that platypuses aren't some mythical creature that snuck their way into reality. Like, I've made a lot of videos on mythical creatures back in the day. They actually were kind of the cornerstone of my channel. And if you watch those videos, well, you're definitely an OG. But I mention this because I have learned about and talked about plenty of mythical creatures that don't have nearly the cool lore that platypuses do. Which, if nothing else, proves that truth is definitely stranger than fiction. But let's move on. Okay, I want to use this moment to mark the turning point in this video. As I mentioned earlier, this video is going to be a two-parter, basically a double feature. I wanted to start with creatures that were verifiably real, or at least extremely closely linked to real creatures, and scientifically believed to be those creatures. But now I'm going to discuss creatures that are either more loosely connected to real creatures that I didn't want to necessarily say as real because the connection's a bit loose, or creatures that essentially have no basis but are still heavily believed in some cultures. Of course, there was a bunch of other real mythical creatures I wanted to mention at the beginning of this video, but I can only add so many. So if you want to see a part 2 where I talk about more mythical creatures that are provably real, then
Damn,
please
was that
leave a
it?
like or leave a comment on this video saying part 2. And finally, I wanted to mention a few
Dude was
honorable
making it sound like it was the end of the video.
mentions for the first part of this video. Two other mythical creatures that turned out to be real are the gorilla and the Haast eagle. And the only reason I didn't mention them in this video was because I actually talked about them in my video last month about myths that turned out to be fact. So if you like this video about mythical creatures that turned out to be true and want to learn about myths that turned out to be fact, after this video, check out that video. I'm going to link it in the description, and I'm also going to pop it on screen at the end of the video. So don't worry about watching it now, but I figured I'd at least mention it because I'm sure some people are going to bring it up. But with that out of the way, let's discuss more mythical creatures with a bit of a looser basis in reality.
The Chupacabra.
Honestly, I was a bit torn on where to put the Chupacabra because personally, I think that the explanation for it makes a lot of sense and for that reason could kind of give a real explanation for this mythical creature.
Can I say something real quick? I just want to say something. So that picture he flashed of that like security camera picture is supposedly footage of the Jersey Devil, not the damn Chupacabra.
But because some descriptions of this creature are so different than the logical explanation, I figured it would be a safe bet to put it in this part of the video. Now, if you're not familiar, the Chupacabra is a legendary mythical creature from Latin America specifically. And it's most popular in places like Mexico
Isn't the name means like goat sucker or something?
or
Cause it like sucks on the blood of cows and goats, and it just leaves them with just like skin and bones.
Puerto Rico. The name chupacabra itself, it literally means goat sucker, and this mythical creature is referred to as the goat sucker because it almost has been exclusively reported to attack livestock, specifically goats in particular. Now, visual depictions of the chupacabra kind of vary drastically. Some descriptions state that the chupacabra looks like a short, reptilian, alien-looking creature that's a couple feet tall, covered in scales and green, while others say that it kind of looks like a hair.
Yeah, I was about to say, I heard the most commonly that it looks like a hairless dog.
Hairless dog with sharp teeth, glowing eyes, and no fur. But regardless of what the mixed visual accounts of
Hairless dog, no fur. Those mean the same thing.
the chupacabra look like, the one common denominator among all accounts is its trademark method of murder, which is, of course, to bite the neck of the goat, drain all its blood, and leave it for dead, essentially being vampiric in nature. And it's because of this consistent and strange method of attack, coupled with its strange look, that turned the chupacabra into legendary folklore in Latin America, and now more parts of the world as well. Here's the deal. Some people that live in rural Latin America, whether they own livestock or not, believe in the chupacabra deeply, and for that reason go to extra measures to ensure the safety of their animals, pets, or even themselves. And it's because of this, once again, like we've seen in other sections, that the widespread belief and fear caused scientists to take a closer look at what actually was going on, because they didn't believe there was a mythical creature on the loose, and for that reason, they wanted to get to the bottom of it. And the conclusion they came to after years of research was
Chupacabra
simple, but
sounds like a pretty realistic, like it could be real. Like, I don't mean like sucking blood like a vampire, but like, well, like sucking blood, but not like sucking blood through the teeth like a vampire. You know what I mean?
in my opinion, likely the case. Many scientists believe that the chupacabra mythical creature is more of a sad situation than a legendary sighting. What they believe is that the chupacabra, in most cases, is a wild dog or even coyote with a disease known as mange. And what mange does, at least in severe cases, is causes the animal's hair to fall out, causes them to be emaciated, and causes them to be extra aggressive. Traits that are almost exclusively associated with chupacabra attacks
Pretty sure my dog Ariel had mange.
and sightings. For scientists who believe that to be the case, they deem the story of the chupacabra legend to kind of highlight how folklore can sort of spawn from real-world events, but through storytelling, exaggeration, and fear of the unknown, grown into something much different, and even in some cases, an entirely new entity of its own, causing a creature in reality to be the artistic inspiration for a creature in mythology.
Vampires.
Since we were on the topic of blood-sucking mythical creatures, I figured why not talk about the most iconic of all, the vampire. The stories of vampires exist across multiple different cultures across...
Another thing is like, how would a wild coyote with mange or a stray dog with mange like be able to suck up like your goat's blood and dip?
multiple different eras of history. But most people typically associate vampires with Eastern Europe specifically. Think Transylvania. If I asked you to describe a generic vampire, what would you describe? Tall, skinny man, slicked back black hair, emaciated skinny face, sharp teeth, sunken in eyes, basically looking dead? Interestingly,
like that.
descriptions of vampires have stayed relatively consistent from the 1800s to today. Although how this mythical folklore creature is treated definitely differs by time period. At the time of the vampire's establishment in the 18th century in Eastern Europe, the story of vampires was treated a lot more like fact than fiction. For good reason too. In countries like Romania and Albania, life was hard, and mysterious disease was prevalent. It was for this reason that individuals were looking for almost any explanation they could find on why people were seemingly dying mysterious deaths. And besides just theorizing on what it could potentially be, they decided to go directly to the source, which included digging up people who have died from these diseases. And what they found was gruesome. Upon digging up the graves of people that have died, they found bodies that they believed to look alive. But not only did they look alive, they looked like they had attacked somebody. Bodies that were dug up from these graves had blood around their mouths. Their body was bloated. It appeared that their hair and fingernails had grown. and it was then assumed that these individuals were not dead at all. They were simply playing dead during the day, but at night, they were becoming undead and causing some of these mysterious deaths. And it was this discovery
I
that
think
triggered
you mean sleeping.
a short-lived mass hysteria, which we later adopted into pop
Playing dead during the day, I think that's called sleeping during the day and then waking up at night.
culture in the modern day, but I'll get to that later. The result of this mass hysteria depends on the region in which we're talking about, but some of the most common practices involved digging up bodies and chopping off their heads if they looked like they were vampires, burning coffins or burning people as soon as they die to prevent them from becoming vampires, or simply staking down bodies in coffins to prevent them from being able to get up. Now, it should be noted that this hysteria was typically shared among lower classes, and the royalty at the time in the regions were actively trying to disprove the vampire myth so that they could prevent the amount of bodies that were being dug up. And they eventually enacted laws to prevent tampering with graves to prevent more graves from being dug up, as they believed that the whole vampire hysteria was total garbage. Now, at a glance, it might seem interesting how these royals knew anything more than the common people. But then when you realize that, well, the royals were the really only people that had access to any sort of education, including education about biology, it becomes easier to understand how potentially these people could have more context on life and reality than people that are essentially kept in the dark and have to fight every single day to get a morsel of food. Regardless, after the hysteria died down, beliefs about vampires were extinguished for the most part. However, the legend did not die, and stories that were originally used as words of warning were now used for entertainment, and eventually evolved to the vampire stories that we now know and associate with the creature today.
Mermaids.
For hundreds of years, sailors across the globe from different cultures, from different civilizations, have all told similar stories of beautiful half-woman, half-fish creatures out at sea, either seducing, singing.
Yep, they try to call you to the ocean. So you get in there and you try and get them. Like they try to get you to save them. Or like they try to get you in there so they can have their way with you or something like that. And then like they drown you.
Songs or trying to lure these sailors, typically to their doom. But what if I told you that the mythical creature of the mermaid may have more basis in reality than you may think? And in my opinion, the explanation that experts have come up with is utterly hilarious. I really don't think I need to explain what a mermaid is, so I'm just gonna kind of get into it. But right now, if you had to guess, what real-world animal do you think inspired the story of the mermaid? If I told you the
I don't
manatee,
know.
would you believe me? Because that is, of
I've
course,
heard of this theory before.
the case. Now, while at a glance it may seem hilarious to suggest that a manatee could inspire the story of the mermaid, these experts do have some claims that have at least a bit of validity. For starters, manatees are large, typically human-sized, at least from a distance. They live mostly in warm coastal waters, and they are considered by some to have human-like characteristics. For starters, manatees are typically seen standing in shallow water, poking their heads out of the water, which at a distance, either in foggy water or rough water, could look like a person. They also have flippers that contain bones.
I'm not gonna lie to you, that face does not look human. And even from a long ways away, I'm pretty sure I would be able to tell that was not a human. Like, that's literally gray skin.
Which they can use in a similar fashion to human hands to try to grab or move objects. And if you weren't really looking, you could say they have a sort of humanoid shape, especially if you're only seeing the bottom
Are you kidding me? That's a humanoid shape to you?
of them above water and the top of them underwater. Now, interestingly, if you want a historical account, in 1493, Christopher Columbus himself reported seeing mermaids, but also noted that they were not nearly as beautiful as he expected, which does give more validity to the experts' theory that, well, mermaids were actually likely inspired by manatee sightings. But in my opinion, these sailors would have had to have a lot to drink if they saw manatees and started seeing beautiful women. Like, talk about beer goggles. But with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going.
That sounds maybe a bit more accurate. Like people drunk and then they're like, oh my god, like it's dark. Or like or something and they're like, oh my god, it's a mermaid. And it's a manatee over there. That makes more sense.
going to end this video. If you loved this video about mythical creatures that either actually exist or are at
That
least
was a really
based
good
in
video.
reality,
I really
then please
enjoyed that
leave a
one.
like or
Mythical creatures that turned out to be real, part 2.
if I know one thing, I know I don't know anything at all. For instance, if you're over the age of 65, then you are likely going to believe every fake AI article you see on Facebook. Reversely, if you're
That's-
young and suspicious,
That's my grandma and literally anybody above the age of 40.
essentially jaded by all of the obvious lies being perpetuated by the mainstream media, then you're more than likely not going to believe anything you read online. But what if I told you that there was one area of study where both of these groups could come together, where people who believed in fairy tales were right and people who discounted mythology were wrong? Well, of course, that's what this video is all about. And like the first episode I did in this series, this video is going to be a bit of a double feature. I'm going to start by discussing a list of mythical creatures that surprisingly turned out to be totally true. And at the end of the video, I'm going to speed around a small list of mythical creatures that are heavily believed to be true, or at the very least have a strong basis in reality. If that sounds good to you, drop a like or your pants and let's get started.
The African
What?
unicorn.
What?
The year was 1887, and Welsh-American journalist Sir Henry Morton Stanley was spending time in the Congo exploring and documenting unique types of terrain he could find. Every day he would journal his findings and send his journal entries back home to be distributed by the press. And for many, his findings were both insightful and interesting. However, nothing
That has got to be like a lot of fun. Like, gotta be like like one of the first people exploring and like discovering through the shits in the jungle, and then like finding all sorts of new animals, discovering all sorts of new stuff through these thick bushes and thick viney trees, and it's just all these hidden places that just hides life, and just all these everywhere, these bug species, these just everything, dude. Just discovering everything.
became as interesting and as mysterious as the journal entry he sent on one fateful day. According to press report coverings of Henry's journeys in 1887, it was discovered that in one of his journal entries, Henry had mentioned that he was informed by locals about this animal that looked kind of like a donkey, but also had the body of a horse, the legs of a zebra, and the head of a giraffe, and was referred to by locals as an ati. This simple mention of a new and mysterious creature was more than enough for this sheer observation to become mythology back home in Europe. People following Henry's travels were so enamored by what he could have possibly seen, and whether or not he had just discovered some sort of new animal, or if potentially he had come across something of mythology. And while theories and interest grew with individuals back in Europe, unfortunately, Henry was not able to get to the bottom of the situation during his time in the Congo. However, others were. Enter Sir Harry Johnston. He was the British Special Commissioner in Uganda. However, while spending time in the Congo, he noticed a group of pygmy people being abducted by German explorers who were planning on taking these natives back home to Europe to display them in a human zoo, something that wasn't unheard of back in the late 1800s
What?
and early 1900s. Fortunately, Harry was able to prevent this from
Human
happening,
zoo?
and during his encounter with the pygmy people, he decided to ask them if they knew anything
They had fucking human zoos? That's disturbing. What, they have like one of each race there?
about this Ati creature, as Harry Johnston was an avid fan of Henry Morton Stanley's journeys, and was rather curious about this elusive creature that he briefly mentioned. And interestingly, the locals had quite a bit of information. Not only did the locals confirm that they knew exactly what Harry Johnston was talking about, they also were able to show him literal tracks in the ground of where this animal was recently seen. And interestingly, while Harry was expecting to see some sort of horse track in the mud, assuming that this mythical creature was nothing more than a common horse, what he saw was that the footprint was of an animal that was cloven-hoofed, or essentially had 2 toes instead of 1, further thickening the plot and adding more plausibility of this animal truly being something new and also something real. Although, unfortunately, even Harry Johnston himself was never able to see an African unicorn with his eyes. However, he was able, through trade with locals, to obtain pieces of its skin and a skull. And with those pieces of evidence, he was able to have a new species of animals classified known as the Okapi johnstoni
That
in
is so
1901.
weird. That is so cool looking. I don't think I've ever
Those pieces
seen
of evidence,
anything
he
like
was able
that
to have
before.
a new species of animals classified known as the Okapi.
That is weird. That is a really weird looking animal. That's kind of cool looking though.
Okapi johnstoni in 1901. And from that point, with this new creature being established in the scientific community and in the zeitgeist back home in Europe, the myth only began to grow further and further, with some people referring to this mysterious creature as the African unicorn. Because while some people believed it existed, nobody at this point had seen it, at least not Europeans. However, we all know that the locals had very much so seen it and known about it for centuries, as descriptions, drawings, and even pieces of dead African unicorns circulated across Europe. It wasn't long until zoologists back home in Europe finally started to take this description a bit more seriously, as now they had undeniable proof that not only did they have a brand new animal theorized and potentially spotted in Africa, but now that they physically had parts of it in their hands that they could not attribute to any other animal, they knew they had something quite serious and quite special. And from 1901 to today in 2026, we have learned so much about the amazing and elusive African unicorn that we now know to be the very real creature known as the okapi. As I described previously, the okapi kind of just sounds like an animal that was put together in the parts bin. It just has the head of a giraffe, the body of a horse, and the legs of a zebra. Interestingly, the okapi not only looks like a miniature giraffe, but it literally acts like one too. It uses its extremely long tongue to rip leaves off of trees.
Bro? It's like an anteater.
Also has to spread its legs quite comedically to drink water off the ground. Unsurprisingly, the okapi is the closest known relative to the giraffe. However, they do share some glaring differences. The okapi really only grows to be about 5 feet tall. However, it does have a considerably long neck for its size, as well as long, flexible ears, similar to a giraffe. However, good luck trying to find one. The habitat that they live in by default is extremely remote, making it extremely tough to traverse. And the okapi is a master of traversing and hiding within that jungle. And when I say master, I mean it. The first photo ever taken of an okapi was taken by a trail camera in 2008, over a century after this animal was given its own scientific classification. And the known population is low due to the fact that this animal is considered endangered because of deforestation and illegal poaching. Which is why in 1987, the Okapi Conservation Project was established to help protect them from those two factors. But yeah, if you were a European explorer traveling across the Congo in the late 1800s or early 1900s, and you just happened to be told by some locals about a creature that had the legs of a zebra, the body of a horse, and the head of a giraffe, it's very likely that you and everybody back home reading your journals would have believed you had just been told about some local mythology, rather than some local biology. However, like we've seen here, sometimes fact is stranger than fiction. And this only further drives home the point that you should always respect the locals.
The Kraken.
The Kraken is one of the most legendary mythical
creatures. This
creatures.
is one of my favorite mythical creatures out there, in my opinion. Just a giant octopus or giant squid, just that attacks boats and just rips them in half with its tentacles. It's just awesome.
There is. It originates from Scandinavian folklore, and the legend of the Kraken has spread globally, including references in numerous American movies. Hollywood aside, the mythology of the Kraken is relatively simple. Just imagine an octopus capable of sinking a massive battleship simply by wrapping its tentacles around it and dragging it under the water. Early legends surrounding the Kraken came directly from sailors who claimed to have seen gigantic sea monsters off the coast of Norway and Iceland. And all of these original accounts claimed similar things, specifically that the creature they saw could very much so sink a ship of any size, and that the monster had seemingly impossibly large tentacles, as well as just generally enormous proportions. As far as story and mythology goes, there are countless Scandinavian stories of Kraken encounters amongst Scandinavian sailors. However, one of the earliest detailed descriptions of the alleged Kraken came from a Danish bishop and a natural historian in the 18th century. It was reported that both of these individuals were on a ship far off the coast of Norway. During his encounter with the Kraken, the Danish bishop allegedly described the Kraken as, quote, so enormous that sailors would sometimes mistake it for an island, and when it submerged, it created whirlpools that could sink ships. Those two descriptions alone are no joke, especially coming from somebody who is supposed to be such a trustworthy member of society. However, even with that account, amongst all of the other countless accounts, many scholars were not buying it whatsoever, and simply discredited all of these stories of the Kraken as folktales and pure myth. However, that was until the 19th century when scientific discoveries more or less forced scientists to change their tune. During the mid to late 1800s, a large number of squids became stranded on the shores of Newfoundland in Canada. And while that on its own was mysterious,
that's a huge fucking squid.
One of these squids that was stranded on the shore was enormous. and it was reported that the head or mantle of the squid was 20 feet long, and that one of the tentacles was 35 feet long. And it was with this discovery, as well as other discoveries that followed it, that not only proved that squids could be a lot bigger than previously thought, but it also caused the scientific community to begin to theorize if possibly these newly discovered giant squids were potentially the inspiration for all of the Kraken stories they seemingly could not avoid in the past. And this newly found theory only got bolstered as time went on, and was more or less
That's
cemented
so
with the
crazy.
discovery of the colossal squid. Essentially an even more mysterious version of the giant squid that was discovered in the waters of Antarctica. With the discoveries of both the giant squid and the colossal squid, as well as some other notable discoveries, one of which being a sperm whale that washed up on shore with massive suction cup scars all over its body, essentially
Those are
proving
suction
that these
cup
squids not only
scars?
existed but were hostile, ultimately proved that not only was there massive squids, much larger than we could have ever possibly thought.
What if the Kraken was like just the biggest colossal squid that ever lived in this certain time period, and it just this gigantic squid just lived off of like the coast of Iceland or Norway?
Gave a lot of validity to the idea of the mythical creature known as the Kraken, and that while some of these stories may have been exaggerated, there was definitely at least a kernel of truth in those stories. But yeah, the reason why giant squids and colossal squids are so rarely seen is simply because they live in such deep waters. And if you watched my video about the craziest deep sea creatures, then you would know about two phenomena known as deep sea gigantism and polar gigantism. And what those essentially are is that for some reason, fish that live in very deep water or in very cold deep water just kind of end up growing to massive proportions for no apparent reason. And the giant and colossal squids are examples of that. But because they're in such deep and remote waters, they're never seen. But when they are, well, they're obviously mind-boggling, because we're still talking about them today and telling stories about them as if they're fairy tale creatures. But as we've learned, for better or for worse, terrifyingly, they're real. And while the exact descriptions of the Kraken may not be 100% real, if nothing else, we know the source material is definitely out there, deep within the ocean.
Dire wolves.
If you've ever watched Game of Thrones, then you are more than familiar with the animal known as the direwolf. In the show, direwolves were legendary, seemingly mythical creatures that presented essentially as extremely smart and extremely large wolves. And while there's a lot more lore about the specific direwolves in that show, that's basically all that's relevant to this section. Interestingly, across many different types of media, many different cultures, and many different time periods, direwolves have been mentioned as an extremely strong, smart, and large creature being symbolic of strength, bravery, and endurance. And while there is seemingly endless mythology surrounding the direwolf and similar creatures, ranging all the way to the extremes of the werewolf, the reality is that the direwolf is, or at least was, a very much so real creature that had roots far deeper than mythology or pop culture. However, there was pretty significant differences. Interestingly, the direwolf kind of differs from a lot of the other animals we've discussed in this series simply because, for the most part, at least in the modern day, it was believed to be a mythical creature far after we knew of the original creature existing. And that's simply because the popularity of the direwolf came, for the most part, in the form of pop culture. And if you happen to be exposed to a giant
Direwolf is a pretty badass name, but you know what would be the even more badass name? The Great Wolf.
intelligent wolf that you saw on TV, you wouldn't necessarily be inclined to believe that it was real. And I don't think you could even be faulted for that assumption either. However, if you do end up doing a bit more digging, you will find that while this creature doesn't exist currently, it very much so did over 10,000 years ago. However, they don't quite perfectly match their movie adaptations. Archaeologists using carbon dating on fossils were able to prove that direwolves did exist in North and South America from roughly 100,000 years ago to roughly 10,000 years ago. And these fossilized skeletons that
Wait,
they were able
aren't
to
they, like,
find
back
of these
now?
direwolves were able to prove.
Aren't direwolves like back now? Give me a second. No, they're not. They're like gray wolves that are designed to mimic direwolves. Mammoths will be back when GTA 6 comes out between 2027 and 2028. They're gonna combine frozen mammoth DNA with the DNA of Asian elephants, so it's gonna be an actual mammoth. But it's gonna be like a mixed breed between an Asian elephant and a mammoth. That's pretty badass, though.
prove that these wolves did have massive jaws, strong teeth, and more or less live the lives of regular modern-day gray wolves. They live in packs, they hunt in packs, and they typically are primed to take down large prey. And while dire wolves are definitely bigger than modern-day wolves, they're not as big as you see on the big screen. According to fossil
Dude, imagine watching these things just fight.
data, real dire wolves are only about 25% bigger than modern-day gray wolves. And it's believed they evolved to grow to this size as a survival mechanism, as most of the available prey at the time was simply huge. It's believed that dire wolves were hunting horses, bison, and giant ground sloths, which we'll talk about later. And when your only available food sources are much larger than you, your only real options are either get bigger yourself or die completely. And the dire wolf actually ended up doing both. They were able to reach an impressive and pretty terrifying size. However, it is believed that their extinction is linked to the disappearance of that large prey that they fed off of during the end of the last ice age. But yeah, if you ever see a crazy, exaggerated version of an animal on TV or in a movie, well, it might be wise for the most part to assume that that's just a movie exaggeration and not something that's real. There are very rare and very few instances where the animal or creature being referenced is, while mythological in aura, very real in, well, reality. Oh, and I know because I'm gonna get comments about it. Yeah, roughly a year ago, there was a company that tried to bring back the dire wolf, and while they did claim
they lied.
that they actually did it, many biologists ended up debunking that claim, saying that they really didn't do anything significant in reviving
Fucking lying pieces of shit bullshitters. You fucking bastards.
an extinct bloodline. And they more or less just kind of put old genes in a new animal, and it's not the same. And that's kind of a different story. But while I could see that technology getting kind of scary or potentially misused, I do think it would be pretty cool to see a woolly mammoth in the modern day. Although I don't know if that would be a good idea. Okay, this is up to
No, I think that's a great idea, dude. I would love to see a mammoth modern day. That would be beautiful, dude. Once, like, can you imagine, like, 20, 30 years, like, mammoths, widespread zoos? That would be awesome.
topic, but do you smell that? It smells like you didn't use absolutely left just in but to help your shower. Giant ground sloths. I know in the last section I just casually dropped giant sloths as one of the natural prey of the dire.
What is this? Is this turned into the prehistoric animal, fucking prehistoric animals that used to exist or some shit? Is that what the video is turned into now?
I figured I would give it its own section. One, because you guys deserve the context, but two, because it literally is its own mythical creature that did turn out to be real. Let me explain. In 2009, a farmer in the south of Brazil was driving a tractor through his cornfield. When suddenly,
I thought they went extinct a long ass time ago.
he started to feel his tractor begin to sink into the ground. He tried to drive out of whatever hole
Oh, was it an old giant ground sloth tunnel?
he drove himself into, but unfortunately the tractor wouldn't budge.
That was like underneath.
And as he noticed that the tractor began to sink, he quickly jumped off and realized that what he had found was not a hole in the dirt, but actually the entrance to a massive underground cavity.
Yep.
And while he found the discovery unusual,
Ground sloth tunnel.
he was too intrigued to not look inside. And what he found was a massive tunnel that was 2 meters tall, 2 meters wide, and ran 15 meters long. And shockingly, the tunnel even went directly under his own home. After discovering
That
this
is so cool, dude. That's actually really cool. Dude, build something under there.
mysterious massive cave, he brought over some of his friends to try to investigate what this could possibly be. And the theories they came up with were wild. One of his friends believed that this tunnel was an ancient burial ground for ancient treasures, and that they should start digging to see what they could find. And another one of his friends
That's
believed that
silly.
this had to be an ancient tunnel dug by ancient animals, potentially an animal that no longer exists. And that theory was actually bolstered by the fact that all of the walls in this tunnel looked like they had scratch marks from an animal on them. And there was never any signs of human life down here. Interestingly, the discovery of this tunnel on this farmer's land quickly spread locally to become more or less of an urban legend, with an alleged mythical creature that had either at one point lived in the tunnel or still currently does. And it was with the spread of this local rumor that
They
local
kind of look like bears a little bit.
researchers wanted to
That outline kind of made it look like a bear.
take a closer look. And with permission of the farmer, they were able to gain access to the cave and were able to investigate what exactly was going on. And what the farmer actually found was much stranger than anything he could have imagined. The tunnel that this farmer had found was not one of a kind. It was actually one of many, and it was only a puzzle piece in the massive puzzle in an ongoing paleontology-based mystery that is still going on to this very day. After investigators were able to get a good look at the inside of the tunnel, they came to the conclusion that this was what was called a paleoburrow, which is more or less of a prehistoric tunnel dug by an ancient, and in this case, giant animal. In the case of this one specific tunnel, it's believed by scientists and geologists that the culprit was actually a giant ground sloth or a giant armadillo. And this tunnel was dug likely over 10,000 years ago. And interestingly, in a report based on this tunnel, a scientist even described a giant ground sloth as a hamster the size of an elephant, combining its relatively innocent nature with its burrowing habits with the impressive and intimidating size of an elephant. Now, if I told you that over 13,000 years ago, there was a sloth the size of an elephant that dug massive tunnels underground in South America, would you believe me? Probably not. And I wouldn't have believed myself either. But it turns out that, yeah, giant ground sloths very much so existed. And for a long time too. But similar to the direwolf, went extinct roughly 12,000 years ago due to the end of the Ice Age, and the massive ecological changes that happened almost globally as a result of it. Now, it's important to note that all ground sloths weren't massive. Some were smaller and only roughly 220 pounds, which is still the size of a large human. However, some giant ground sloths got all the way up to 9,000 pounds and would have easily towered over any human even while laying down. The farmer who found this tunnel in his backyard didn't also discover the giant ground sloth that was actually known about. However, it did spark what ended up becoming a massive discovery of over 1,500 other tunnels across South America. And while the exact history behind these tunnels aren't fully known, it's pretty heavily believed, but not fully proven, that almost all of these tunnels were paleoburrows dug by the ancient extinct giant armadillos and giant ground sloths. Realistically, this section is more or less of a technicality because outside of the locals that lived in this small farm town in southern Brazil, not many people were theorizing about the mythical creature that dug this newly found hole on the farm. However, there were definitely some locals theorizing some interesting things. And while the giant ground sloth itself wasn't, at least to my knowledge, ever believed to be a mythical creature, I think it has all of the characteristics to be one, and in my opinion, just never got that opportunity. However, if there was ever another show similar to Game of Thrones that used giant ground sloths instead of direwolves, there would be a ton of people believing that this animal was simply pure mythology with no basis
I have
in
no
reality.
idea. I've never watched a Game of Thrones ever.
But in that case, they'd be pleased or horrified to learn that only a short 12,000 years ago, sloths as big as a semi-truck that could take out multiple people in one swat were roaming the earth and living hidden in tunnels underground,
That is so
making them, in my opinion, worthy of this list. And speaking of this list, I actually want to mark a quick milestone in this video, because so far we've talked about mythical creatures that have a provable basis in reality, or at least very real origins. But now I wanted to speedrun a few other creatures that don't quite fit that bill, but in my opinion still have enough basis in reality to be mentioned, or at least enough people that believe in it to discuss it here. Let's begin the speed round. Unicorns. I would think it's safe to say that everybody watching this video is quite familiar with what a unicorn is. They appear in numerous ancient mythologies, countless medieval stories, and even religious texts across different cultures. And while it's definitely easy to write off a mythical creature, how could there be so much historical literature about something that truly never existed? Well, what if the stories that were told about these creatures weren't exactly true, but there was a real basis for these creatures? And in the case of the unicorn, it's believed by many historians and scientists that the legend of the unicorn may actually be inspired by the rhinoceros. According to historians and scientists that hold this theory, when ancient travelers from Europe would have traveled across Africa
That makes a lot of sense.
or Asia and saw a large one-horned being, they likely simply misspoke when they described these creatures as horse-like or spoke loosely, when in reality they were looking at something that looked more like a hippo or an elephant, at least in my opinion. But if these individuals were European explorers, they likely didn't have those points of reference either, meaning that the horse theory isn't completely implausible. But I'm really not sold on it, which is why unicorns are in this part of the video and not the first, because there's really not strong proof that medieval travelers that claim to have saw unicorns were actually just seeing rhinoceroses. And personally, I don't really believe that medieval travelers would have mistaken a rhinoceros for a horse. But But I mean, I guess they are four-legged, but regardless, the stories of these unicorns they saw on their travels spread back to Europe, and quickly unicorns became something of legend. And where there are legends, there are economic opportunities. And that's because with the whole unicorn craze, stories began to get crazier and crazier. And people believed that the horns of unicorns actually had magical healing powers. And it was because of this that traders who had access to narwhal tusks would actually sell narwhal tusks as unicorn horns to
Speaking
wealthy
of
individuals.
narwhals, wasn't narwhals like thought to be an urban, like a mythical creature for a while too?
In medieval Europe. But yeah, whether or not European explorers just made up their entire unicorn sightings entirely, or they just misrepresented a rhinoceros as a horse, we may never know. But according to some scientists and historians, there is at least some validity in the theory that unicorns have a genuine basis in reality.
The Maltese tiger.
According to the locals of extremely remote parts of southwest China and Tibet, there lives an extremely mysterious tiger that has not been seen by anybody besides the locals, and this tiger is known as the Maltese tiger. The Maltese tiger more or less resembles a regular tiger in every way, shape, or form. However, the Maltese tiger allegedly has an extremely unique blue
Whoa.
coat of fur. And
That
that's
is
basically it. It's honestly
If
not
that was real, that would be so beautiful. That would actually be really beautiful.
much of a mythical creature. It's literally just a tiger, but blue. Regardless, it's this
imagine-
simple yet interesting claim that has been.
Can you imagine if there were blue cats? Like, imagine having a cat and it was just that shade of blue.
Held tightly by locals for numerous decades, many of which claimed they have seen the tiger, but
That
only
is a
once.
very beautiful
However,
blue.
as of today, there has been no confirmed sightings with picture or video evidence, no Maltese tigers captured, or no evidence of them ever existing, such as a body or even some fur. Locals in remote southwestern China and Tibet swear that the Maltese tiger is a very real creature. But to a majority of the scientific community, the concept of the Maltese tiger is more or less folklore. And while there is interest in discovering the Maltese tiger, or at least getting to the bottom of all of the claims, so far there has been no progress. And the creature remains more or less a mythology. Scientists do believe that locals could be seeing a tiger that has some sort of skin condition, or they're potentially just seeing pale tigers, which could have a more white resemblance. Although none of these theories are confirmed, and we may never know, at least not in our lifetime. But if we've learned anything from this series, the locals typically know something we don't. We've talked about numerous creatures that were believed to not exist only to be found years later. And maybe the Maltese tiger is just another example of that. But just currently ongoing, and not something we're retrospectively reflecting on.
The jackalope.
I kind of saved the best
The
for last year,
jackalope.
and I actually got so many comments about the jackalope in my last video, so I knew I had to mention it. If you're a real Trust Me Bro OG, you would have known that I've actually talked about the jackalope in the past, specifically in my cryptids from every state video. Long story short, the jackalope is essentially an American folklore creature that is literally just a jackrabbit with antlers. And in my opinion, it looks really cool, and I wish it was real. Obviously, the jackalope is not real. However, the mythology came to be because of some interesting taxidermists who were looking to play a hoax, and it kind of just grew from there. During the early 1900s, taxidermists thought it would be funny to start attaching small pairs of deer antlers onto taxidermied rabbits and sell them to tourists as a local rare creature. And people bought it up because it looks cool. And because of this, the lore kind of spread, and people believed that these were real creatures. But in reality, this was literally just the morbid creation of a taxidermist. Now, what's interesting is we've discussed a couple animals in this series already that people thought were taxidermy play dummies, specifically the platypus and the okapi. But in the instance of the jackalope, this literally was the creation of man in a rather morbid way. Although the result was actually kind of cool, albeit it was just something to trick people for profit, so I don't love it that much. But the concept is cool. I guess if we're following the rules of this video, you could say that there is a basis of reality for the jackalope because rabbits are real, but that's basically as far as it goes. Although I have seen some reports, or at least some people mention, that there is rare instances where rabbits will essentially grow small bones on their heads, or even have fungal growths on their heads, which in some cases could resemble antlers. But those are not necessarily consistent and don't prove
Yeah, but that's not really where it originated from. The jackalope didn't originate from people seeing fungal growths on rabbits and then saying, "Oh my god, it's a jackalope."
To be true, but they're worth mentioning. It's kind of like saying those people in the Guinness World Records books that grew horns prove that horned people exist. That's not really the case. That's really more or less of an anomaly. But I think that's enough about getting all horned up. Hopefully you guys loved this video. And if you did, I would love you to
This
check out this
was
video on
fire.
screen right
This
now.
was a
It's actually
really
a video
fun
I just
one.
released on my
I
brand
really
new
like
gaming
this one
channel.
a lot.
I've posted 4 videos on the channel now, so there's definitely something you'd like on there.
Alright, that was a really good video. I like that one a lot. Watch this dude, pretty please. It's a good channel. Alright, peace out.